All right, thank you very much. I'm so excited to welcome our guests today, and we are very much looking forward to a discussion rooted in the topics and questions submitted by teachers from all over who are looking to grow and learn in this area. I'll do a quick introduction of each of our panelists here today, starting with Mr. Tom Rademacher. I'm so happy you're here today. You want to tell us just a quick word about yourself?
Yeah, I'm an 8th grade language arts teacher just outside of Minneapolis, which is Anishinaabe and Dakota land. I'm also a writer and just published my 2nd book. It's called Raising Ollie.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We're so happy you're here. Dr. Nicole Joseph, we're so happy you're here as well. Can you please let us know who you are briefly here?
Yeah, I'm Nicole Joseph. I'm an associate professor of math education at Vanderbilt. I am also a former middle school math teacher. I also worked as an instructional math coach. Both of those roles in Seattle public schools, where I'm born and raised. And I'm just excited that I'm healthy in this world that we are living in right now.
As are we. Thank you very much for that. I'm so happy you're able to join us today. Thank you. Dr. Rochelle Gutierrez, we are so honored and excited to have you here as well.
Share a few words, please. Yeah. So I'm joining you from the lands of the Peoria, the Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Botawadamik, Ojibwe, and Chickasha nations. And, I would just want to recognize that these are the original stewards of these lands, and that those at the University of Illinois, and myself included, we benefit from occupying these lands. And I pay my respect to those people who have fought to nurture these lands. And I see the Black Lives Matter movement is intricately connected with Indigenous people's rights, because the United States, their story, our story, is one of stolen hands working stolen lands. And I commit to learning to work every day to try to dismantle systems of interlocking oppressions, and so that we can be in right relation once again, not only with each other, but with our more than human relatives. I am working at the University of Illinois, where I have been working with pre-service and practicing teachers for 26 years. I also was a previous middle school and high school math teacher in the Bay Area in California in Title I schools, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and to all of you for being here today. I'm so grateful for all that you're bringing to the table, and you're sharing your experience so generously with all of us. The format here is that teachers who have registered from pre-K through in some cases teacher service programs have submitted topics and questions that are front of mind for them as they are engaged in this work. They have submitted those and we've shared those with you. Is there anything in that submitted group that stood out, or an idea that you said, oh, I hope we get to dig into this, or I'd like to address this topic or idea when we jump in? And we'll wait for the water to flow through the garden hose in a moment. It sputters a bit at the top and then flows more cleanly after that. So if there's anyone like to jump in, or a question something they want to jump in with.
Go, Nicole.
I was waiting for you, Rochelle, to start us off, kick us off. Because rehumanizing and humanizing is a big topic in these questions.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe the question that I'm looking at is one that, I've grappled with my whole life, and that I think that is one that's difficult for teachers to navigate. And that's that question that, is it possible to humanize spaces in education that were designed to be dehumanizing? I am thinking on a more macro level, like one teacher in one classroom may be able to humanize their space, but what about an entire school? And I think this is such an important, first of all, I want to applaud the person who recognizes that aspect, that, this is reminiscent of Audre Lorde's work, which, we know that we can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. So the work that needs to be done, us as teachers, as we reclaim this profession of education, we need to constantly be working against and working outside of schools, right? So that means that the work that we take up, we don't fool ourselves into thinking, oh, I've gotten all my kids to get this score on a test, or oh, all my kids are on board with a growth mindset, or oh, I have whatever kind of very minute measure of success or reform, this kind of inch forward way of thinking, that I know that that's not all of my work as a teacher. And we think about education, we know that teachers are influencing the lives of students, that we plant seeds all the time that we have no idea how they grow. They're in the interactions that we have with our students. They're in the ways that we hold ourselves and who we hold ourselves accountable. They're in the ways that we model for our students when we're in conversation with other teachers. What do we even choose to talk about and why? They hear us. They're watching all of this, parents as well, administrators as well. And so when I think about that idea of, yeah, we're not trying to rehumanize just by working within the system, but we're also recognizing that there is some work that can be done in the system. I mean, students are still attending schools. They are still required in a compulsory way to be in school buildings. So I guess I'll kind of just start there. I can say so much more, but I think it's in being in that tension. You know, I often talk about the notion of Nepantla in my work, which is this kind of it's Nawa metaphysics, but it's basically, you can think of it as both a way of grappling and being in the tensions all the time and not trying to choose one way or another to go, but to be happy to be in those tensions. And I think that a teacher who is critically working to dismantle these systems of interlocking oppression recognizes that Nepantla space, that I am both trying to play this game and change this game, and I'm conscious of this is what I'm doing, and I know I'm not having to decide one or the other. I guess that's how I'd launch it. So I'm interested in pushback, or I'm interested in more conversation about that. I mean, there's so much more we can go with.
I mean, I think that we've always had educational spaces that have been like dehumanizing. Like, I don't feel like there's anything new. I think what COVID did was basically just help the world to see with really clear crystal eyes what a lot of marginalized communities have known for years and years and years and years. And so I often talk about like my own work too, Rochelle, and you know this, that, you know, I try to sit at that intersection of Nepantla, meaning that I do want to tear down the system because it's not working for a lot of racialized communities. And you guys know that I study Black girls. At the same time, I'm like a teacher diehard, and I know that they're going to show up on Monday. So what can I do to think about Monday, right? And so I mean, I think that being able to really understand and name stuff and to be intentional about the ways that we can support students in having a humanizing experience in mathematics is really important. For example, I mean, we have some basic things. For example, I think math is taught in ways that's terrible for everyone, right? Rote memorization, those kinds of things. We're not doing deep conceptual thinking, problem posing, interesting problems. We're not doing that. But then it becomes, in my mind, super consequential when you're talking about communities that haven't had a lot of access to the culture of power around, you know, being in the right math track, or, you know, being prepared for college and those kinds of things. So I think teachers need to be well aware of what those macro issues are, so that they can, when they're designing a lesson, like they can think about things like, how do I make sure that all of my students are going to get access to understanding, I don't know, line of best fit, or whatever it is that you're teaching, right? If you haven't thought about that macro thing and the story of how students have been marginalized in our educational systems, that's not something you're going to think about. So I'll stop and let Tom jump in.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I think just from you know, where I am, like literally in my classroom right now, like it's a challenge to see things from the real macro level, I think I fell victim to this idea that like, as long as I made my four walls as good as they could be, that was the work, you know? But, you know, my kids walk to my room from other rooms. One, I'm not going to make my room perfect, right? Like my room is still a place where those things are happening. And so I guess where I've evolved, where my work has evolved, it's really been about building community within school, both so that I have other people who are keeping me accountable to that work, and so that, you know, when a critical mass is kind of reached within a building where change starts to feel more possible, and there are more and more spaces that are more and more positive for students, you know, like then I feel like I'm trying not to like lean into like any kind of hyperbole of like, and then we're going to achieve some level of anti-racist education, which like I feel so far away from. And then I think, you know, like Dr. Joseph was saying, the things that are wrong with education are only more wrong when you're talking about marginalized communities, right? And so, and then one thing I have been seeing and coming up against is that then the answer is, well, then my equity or my anti-racist work is to fix this thing that's wrong with schools, but they'll do so without specifically addressing, you know, like racist practices or something like that, right? And the idea is like, well, if we can just fix math class or fix the reading structure, fix the whatever, and like better instruction will always be better. But I think that's where you need a community that will constantly be challenging, and making sure that like race is being specifically addressed while you are creating the new system. Because I've never seen a system that can't be weaponized by people who haven't done that work.
Yeah, so important. You know, it's, and yeah, there's so much to take into what there's so many pieces I want to like connect with, and I'm like, which one should I pull from? But I'm going to talk about this. I think the part that hit me first was when you were saying, you know, I used to think about my four walls, and as long as I was doing what I was doing, I was kind of doing right by kids, right? And I think that was the way I used to think as well. And I think later I started to recognize that like it wasn't even enough, even if my students had an amazing experience in my room, were they prepared to question the practices that they would get in other people's classrooms? And would they be prepared to do that in a way that wouldn't get them in trouble in other people's classrooms, right? So I didn't want to set my students up for the kind of disciplinary actions that were like, why are you questioning me? Or why are you questioning me in that way, right? Where maybe some of those things might feel like, well, when you're speaking to somebody who also agrees with, you know, when we think about, you know, problem solving or any kind of aspect of a classroom, we have to say, for what purpose and who benefits, right? So if we're saying, why do we want to understand problem solving? What do we want to understand about the notion of patterns, right? Then if we're getting students to ask those questions, then we have to say, now what happens when you're in another space? What happens when you're in another classroom, when you're in college, when you're in a job, when you're in, how do you take these up? In a way, we've been having this conversation in my classroom over this year. How do you take that up? And I feel like that's one of the things that I've been working more with teachers, is thinking about how not to just themselves be creatively insubordinate, but how to prepare their students to be creatively insubordinate. And again, that creative part is like, I'm trying to help support teachers that they don't get fired, right? It's not just be insubordinate. I want the same for my students. I don't want them to have, you know, a backlash.
I think that's huge. And I think that I love the idea of creatively insubordinate, and us can already feel in my head like the wariness of the line there of also like teaching students to navigate an equitable system in a way that helps perpetuate the system, right? Of like, oh no, I'm doing something good by teaching students, you know, like to almost like to accept some of that dehumanization of like, well, of course you're going to have these teachers that treat you really poorly or whatever. And like, your job is to like, I don't know, accept that and deal with it or whatever it is. I like the idea of like, no. It's not about that. It's about being creatively subordinate, of finding ways to stand up for yourself and stand for what a school you deserve in a way that's going to be productive. I really like that.
In a lot of our conversations and our regular calls around recognizing some of these ideas, we refer, it sounds similar, we refer to it as bringing greater definition to our discretionary power in our classroom and in our school. Like there's the expectation that we'll teach this part, and then we will. And then there's also an incredible amount of discretionary power with which you can learn the edges of, learn how to get creative with it, learn to say, oh, what you have so much more available to you in that classroom space, in that school space, within that larger community space, and kind of learning what that feels like when you hold it, when you talk about it, address it. So I love that idea as well. For a teacher there.
Greg, could you read that question? I can't find it, about the standards. Somebody had a question about the how can you be engaged in humanizing?
It was a similar one there, I think, and it sounds similar to what we were just talking about there. Someone submitted, how can you make sure students can succeed at playing the game while also helping them realize the power they hold to change the game? And how does this tie to frequent standardized testing and also how many standards they are? Is that the one you're referring to?
I was actually referring to the one that says, how do we negotiate rehumanizing a curriculum with state standards that are themselves dehumanizing? I'm curious to know my big sis Rochelle's thoughts on this, because, I was teaching in 1999, well before I had a PhD, well before I understood what culturally responsive or culturally linguistic, like I didn't have any of that. And I Eilerized, my they were called the Washington Eilers, those assessments. I took interesting things that I thought my kids would be interested in because they told me they were interested in, and I did my best to try to wrap those standards or map those standards or whatever onto that. And I didn't get to everything that I was supposed to, and I felt like that was okay because I used portfolios, and I taught my kids how to have conversations with their parents and with themselves, like, what do you know about fractions? What do you need to know? And like, I tried to help them understand how to unpack a standard. So I didn't know a lot of this stuff, but I relied on veteran teachers. I went to every PD that I could, and I never worked alone. So I'm just curious to know, I didn't feel like the standards were dehumanizing. I just felt like there was just a lot. And I just tried my best to pick and choose where I could make meaning with the kids. But Rochelle, I'm curious to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, unfortunately, I think the standards movement has, been coupled with the high stakes testing. And so even when we want to say, well, the standards themselves aren't dehumanizing, we can say, but the moving walkway that we're on that's connected to is, and when we try to force students into, you need to learn these standards, these years at this time, for schools that don't use, other forms of grading that allow you over a period of time to show that you've mastered something. It's kind of these one-time exam, cuts on student learning. Those are, I think, the most detrimental. But even when you don't have that, there's, as you've spoken, Nicole, I think, at least in Mathematx, when we think about how long we've had this mile wide, inch deep curriculum that we can't seem to get our heads around, why are we forcing kids to go at a rate to cover all this content without getting into any depth? And I think that, you're doing a really, important job by saying, how do I help my students? When you say, what do I need to know about fractions, or what do I need to know about systems of equations, or what do I need to know about any of this information? If they can tell you that back, and it's not in a kind of like reading out of some script way, I think that they're already articulating what they know and maybe don't know. And if they can talk to their parents at home, you're doing two things. One of the problems that we have with people trying to hold us to standards that we think, you know, oh, my kid's not getting this kind of content, is when parents look at what you're doing and can't recognize it as what they did, right? And so when students can kind of be that kind of, you know, transition person and can articulate, can, you know, translate for their parents, here's what I'm learning, here's why it matters, or here's where I am with that learning, then it's clear to the parents that, okay, there is learning that's going on. They are focusing on the content that I know they should be focusing on. It's just that, you know, the presentation of it may not look like it in the homework assignment or something. I also think that today there's probably more room for teachers to be creatively insubordinate with their curriculum because we're not tied to textbooks. I mean, how many teachers these days, when I was teaching, you were teaching out of the textbook, like literally those were the like mimeographed sheets or whatever, but you were like, these were your problems. And that was all you had. You've got the internet now. You have people who are finding, who you know, you have radicalmath.org. You have like all these different organizations that are creating curriculum. You have MitBoss that you can go on to the, you know, the math teacher blogosphere, and you can find other teachers who are doing things. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. But because of that, it also means that you're not as obvious to parents what exactly are you doing in your classroom. And so, you know, showing that your student, by you capturing it in these kind of more authentic, when you were saying you have portfolios, Nicole, you know, capturing these other ways of showing growth, these other ways of showing knowings that are not just tied to test scores, means that you also protect yourself as a teacher. And it's also a more humane way for students to be able to look over a period of time and say, these are all my things. Like I did all of this, right? Rather than like, oh yeah, somewhere I crumpled up that exam I got because I didn't like the score, or I looked at it, I got the A, and then that was all I needed it for. I don't even need to look at that ever again. It's really nice as kind of an honor to yourself to look at all of that work that you've done. Throughout Latin America, people hang on to their notebooks. Where they write their notes, people hang on to them into their adult years, their cuadernos. And that's because it's a record of what you've done in mathematics, of what you've committed to. And it might even be a resource for later. So I think that there's, you know, lots of the things that you were saying about how you were running your classroom, I think have a lot of signposts for people to think about the standards.
You brought up something that's, I mean, you brought up a lot of really, really great things there. I do want to say with the dehumanizing aspect of the testing, I've never been more hit by that than last year when students came back to person for, we had, I mean, I think it was a month and a half, maybe 2 months where kids were back in our building that we had not seen all year long. And 2.5 full weeks of that were spent on various levels of standardized testing, both our state testing and then like our district specific testing. And to put students like finally back in rooms with people in front of computers where they had to sit quietly for 2 hours was like, it was so obviously the wrong answer for those kids right then, right? And to get data that ultimately we aren't going to be able to use until we can compare it with another pandemic that we have at some point, like it seemed just ridiculous. But you brought up this idea of, you know, this tension or this, I don't know, a roadblock, whatever it is that you have to, an obstacle you have to overcome when you start thinking and teaching in new ways. You mentioned that like parents sometimes will struggle because it doesn't look like the school that they had. And I know, you know, as teachers, we also think about like maybe our board or our principal or forces outside of that, or our legislature. And I wonder if either of you have more experience or stuff you can bring to us about, you know, what do you do when you hit those obstacles wherever they are, people like resistance to change?
Well, I think speaking from when I was a teacher, So let me just first say that I was teaching during the times, my principal was a speech therapist. She had never been in a classroom, but had her principal's license. Now today, I think that foolishness, they don't do that. But I just believed in like collaborating and talking with other teachers in my building. I've never, to me, it's not cute that, you know, you're working by yourself. So I just found like the teachers in the building, there were more, this was 5th grade that I'm thinking about. There were other 5th grade teachers that I just, you know, hung out with, and we had conversations, and, you know, we were pretty much on the same page about like trying to do some things differently. And when there's strength in numbers, I think Lonnie wrote a book called Strength in Numbers.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the principal ain't gonna fire everybody. You know what I'm saying? And it's like, you know, the other thing is there's proof in the pudding. When you have children that can articulate things that they are learning and have evidence and are showing you, you know, whatever that is. So we not only, you know, use portfolios, we had journals. So my kids wrote in their math journals. And this again was before this stuff was popular, right? But I learned these techniques in my teacher ed program. So we not only wrote about like the number 0. What do you know about the number 0, right? What's cool about the number 0? We also wrote about like, well, how did you feel about today's lesson? Did you feel like, you know, Dr. Joseph didn't teach you well? You know what I mean? So we had all of those things. And I just feel like when students are able to articulate those things and show with evidence, folks got to back up. You know what I'm saying? If they can see, and let me just be clear, not all of my students passed that test, but what I can say is that all of them grew. All of them were able to articulate things that they learned in math. And a lot of them would come back to me and thank me for, you know, what I helped them to see and learn to love, because my goal was to help them to fall in love with math. I had like one goal. I'm like, math is so dope. Y'all got to figure this out, right? So I hear you, Tom. There's lots of tensions, but my strategies was to work in numbers, you know, work with other teachers and help my kids articulate things that they were learning in different ways.
And as a college professor, I see this all the time. I feel like the effects of the No Child Left Behind generation. I have students who can't articulate what you're doing is basically saying you're going to be an active participant in your own learning. You're going to understand what you know. You're going to understand what you don't know. You're going to understand how to get the tools and resources to learn that from other people in this class. You're going to, like, all those kinds of things are going to be part and parcel with what it means to be a member of this classroom. So when you get to college, you're not going to, you know, throw your hands up in the air and say, like, tell me what's the minimum of getting a grade in this class, right? Because that's what happens when people aren't able to articulate, you know, anything about their own learning. Then they're just, you know, receiving from somebody else what's going to count as your education, and then paying for it. You know, that's the part that I tell my students all the time. You're going to college, you're paying somebody else to tell you what counts as your education. And you're a client. You should be saying, this is what I need. This is what's going to, this is the way I would measure whether or not I'm a better person, I'm a better human in this world, and whether I can do anything with my engineering skills. It's not because I get, you know, this grade in this course. So anyhow, I just think that all of those things that you're doing, Nicole, and I wholeheartedly agree about the you know, working with other teachers. I think the other thing I think about is that sometimes people, you know, hear you talk and they think, you know, oh, that sounds like it's easy for you. You sound like that kind of person who could take on the world. Like you sound like you've got your stuff together, or like maybe you're just, because you're, you know, a person of color, you've had to fight this fight for so long, you actually know what you're talking about. I'm not that kind of person. I don't know all this stuff. I'm a shy person, or I'm a peacemaker. Like, I don't like to make trouble, or my parents raised me to be respectful. Like, I wouldn't actually, you know, stand up to my colleagues in that way or whatever. But, you know, you have to say, at least for me, when I've studied people who I've prepared to use creative insubordination, and I've kind of looked at the difference between people who use creative insubordination a lot and people who don't, the people who use creative insubordination a lot are not going for this low-hanging fruit when they take risks. They're not looking at, if I speak up right now, or if I make this change in my teaching, or if I whatever, is that going to convince somebody else that they should change? And if it's not, then maybe it's not worth it. So they do this kind of cost benefit analysis. That's like the lowest level you can think of when you're thinking risk taking. You can think of risk taking on 2 other levels. The second level is to think about, am I projecting a version of myself that I can be proud of? Like, regardless of whether I convince anybody else at this meeting right now that what we're talking about is a racist policy, or what somebody just said was actually really deficit thinking about kids, or even something my own student said in the class that's just not allowable here. When I decide to step into that and take a risk to say something, to do something, I'm also showing people who I am, and I can feel good that I can look myself in the mirror and say, what I say and do reflects what I think I stand for. But the third level is when you take those risks, you're also modeling for other people around you, what does risk taking look like? And what does it look like when it doesn't benefit you? So all those things are things that I think once you start thinking more broadly, it's kind of like when we say that the teacher who can think about the macro issues as well, that it's not just these micro gains in your classroom, but thinking about how we're part of systems. But once you could start thinking at those other levels of risk taking and recognize that, we've always been fighting this fight. I mean, I think as Nicole said, these school systems were not set up for my people. And they weren't set up for me to be teaching in them. So I have to recognize that all I can do is have integrity in the work that I do in my classroom and the interactions I have with parents and with students. And if I'm not willing to take risks, I have to ask myself, what does that mean? People don't just take risks because they know exactly everything that they're going to do and they have a great solution. You take a risk. It's called a risk because you don't have it all planned out. So I guess I just I encourage people to think about that when you find yourself shying away from taking the risk, and then, making sure that you're taking that risk with as many other people as possible. So you keep your job.
I have a question to ask Rochelle that while working with PreService Teachers, have you thought about maybe this is just not the right profession for you? Now, I mean, I believe that this stuff can be taught. But I also hear Joy Spencer, who's one of our colleagues in San Diego, says, why do we have to wait for white teachers to care about our kids? Mm-hmm. And so I'm just curious to know, because do you feel like there are particular, I mean, of course, let me just be quiet and let you answer the question, because I don't want to offend anyone, but I do think that this is really important, to think about. If you know that this is just not in your core, then maybe you shouldn't be a teacher. And we would love you for that if you came to that. So I'm just curious, Rochelle, how you work through that.
I mean, I think this has become really common among teacher education programs, maybe over the last 5 to 8 years, to really be developing monitoring systems, because, you can get students' assignments and be shocked by some of the things that they're saying, or some of the resistance that they have to things that you just think at a very basic level, like, you're going to have to work with every kind of kid that comes into your classroom. Like, if you're not prepared for that, or you somehow feel like that's pushing you out of your comfort zone, then yeah, maybe there's another profession out there for you. And it's helping people make those informed decisions. But I think what has happened is that, historically, we have not always had those systems in place. So you might get the one teacher, one professor of color, or the one professor who's focusing on these kind of justice issues, who has to call out the student or tries to call in the student. But by then, they might have had 8 other courses before you that are condoning this way of thinking, that are making it seem like, oh, but I don't have to learn bilingual education stuff. I'm not gonna be a bilingual math teacher. I'm not gonna have those students in my class. And it's like, oh, really? Where are you going to be teaching? On Mars? But I think that, you know, helping people see that as not a critique of them as a person, but that we all have gifts to give in this world. And we have to know what those gifts are, and then we have to be able to give them freely. And I think what we learned from projects like Teach for America was that some people, you know, glamorize this kind of missionary profession and clearly didn't stay in it very long because it didn't speak to them. It didn't feed them. Teaching is one of the hardest professions to go into if you don't absolutely love it. You know, it's going to be a hard place to be. It doesn't mean you can't be there, but you have to be prepared for the marathon that you're going to run. This is not a sprint and then you just kind of get out, because there's a lot of investment that people have made in every teacher that graduates from a program and goes out into the field. And that's not just a loss of that labor, but that's then a loss to the students who will get that teacher, and that teacher's still trying to figure out if they should be in teaching.
And I would just add, I agree with every piece of that. And like, thank you both for working with teachers and pre-service teachers especially. And I would just say that like, the number of times in my first like 3 or 4 years of teaching that I was sure that I was not cut out to be a teacher and that I was sure that I shouldn't be. Like, I'm really, really glad now that I didn't quit because I didn't feel like I should be there. Because I do feel like a lot of times we get this message that if you just do all these things, then everything will be easy or whatever, right? And so like, I do not hear you saying if you struggle, that it means that you should not be teaching. I do think those are really good times to do some of that inner work and be like, what about this job am I struggling with? You know, like if you're struggling because you care, because you're trying to meet the needs of all your kids, and because you're finding that it's really hard to do so, but you're willing to do that work, great. If you're struggling because like kids just aren't doing what you're telling them to do and that's what you're looking for, then that's where you're probably seeing a problem. But I think it's a really, like very, very natural to feel like we should not be, that teaching isn't for us because it turned out to be a lot harder than we thought it was going to be. So that's all.
That's so important, Tom. I so appreciate you making that kind of, clarification on what I was saying, because I could see how somebody could take what I was saying as like, if you struggle, maybe you should just get out. And, I think we also don't currently have a system that adequately supports teachers within their first few years of teaching. And we have to acknowledge that this should not be some of the work that teachers have to do within their first few years of teaching. They should not be having to do that. They should be under an apprenticeship model. They should have more supports to be able to be checking in with people and figuring this stuff out. But I think if you are in that mindset, I tell my pre-service teachers, if you find yourself wanting to say things like, why can't these students just be like me? That should be one of your red flags. Why can't they just be me? That basically means I'm not interested in expanding myself into being able to be a support system for people different than me, right? And we can't, if you've been a parent, that each child needs different things. Even if they've come out of your womb, they are different. They will have different responses to the exact same, classroom management that you have in your classroom or in your home. All of those kinds of things will challenge you. But if at that base level, you feel that love for what you teach, as Nicole was saying, I wanted everyone to fall in love with math. If you want that, if you will be persistent, you will do everything you can to get your students to fall in love with math. And if you feel like the version of math you're teaching does not align with what you know mathematics could be, you're also going to fight like tooth and nail to get the version that you know it could be to be in front of them, because I'm never going to get students to fall in love with doing algorithms and taking tests. That's not going to be what they love, and it's not why we got into teaching, right? So Tom, I really appreciated you kind of clarifying that aspect of, you know, when you hit those challenges, because we'll all have them, and throughout your whole teaching career.
I hate to say that we're coming up to the end of our conversation here, this first part, and I'm so grateful to all of you. And I have way more questions in my head than we began with, unfortunately, although I think that's a good sign. The work of rehumanizing our classrooms, our math classrooms, our STEM classrooms, and our English classrooms, how we center what is important, the student in front of us every day, over the system or over the standards or over the assessments, is a lifetime's worth of work. All of us are so grateful to each of you for your time today. We look forward to talking to you on Saturday. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll see you all.
I'm going to stop recording now. Thank you.